Thank you for listening to the Chronicles of Christendom, a survey of medieval literature, by me, Mom Chilo. This podcast is dedicated to bringing light to medieval stories and viewing them from a traditional Christian perspective. I hope you enjoy this episode. Today we're going to discuss one of my most favorite medieval works, which is Chretien de Troyes. So we already did one of his stories earlier. We did Eric and Enid. We did a two-parter on that, and this is also going to be two, maybe a three-parter even. But this time it's on his last work that he wrote, an unfinished work called Perceval, or the Story of the Grail. So this story means a lot to me. Like, if I'm on a desert island, I can only have a couple of books. I'm making sure that Perceval is one of those books on the island with me. I really think it's that good. And I think that if you look at its popularity kind of attests to how, good it is. Because even though this story per se isn't so popular, although at the time it was, there's a lot of manuscripts that we have of this story from around the time. And there's all these kind of continuations of the story, because as we'll see, the story is incomplete. It kind of cuts off mid-sentence. There's all these plot points that are unresolved, and it's unlike Chretien and unlike medieval literature in general to have these unresolved plot points. So it's very much an unfinished story, and people have written, kind of fan edits, fan continuations of the story, and even prologues as well of this. And this story, which is the first story to talk about the Grail and kind of some of the imagery that we have around the Holy Grail. It's the first story to talk about that, and it influenced all these later Arthurian tales that use the Holy Grail, or even other, non-Arthurian stories. It's a very beautiful image that Chretien creates with the Grail, and a lot of people have picked up on it since the medieval ages, including to the modern age. Like, we even, have sayings like, oh, this is the Holy Grail of science. This is the Holy Grail of art collection. And yeah, I really just like the story a lot. I have a long history with this story. I won't go into it, but I've written some articles on it. I'll link on my Substack that I'll link below. Anyway, so this story is called Perceval, or the Story of the Grail. So it's written by Chretien de Troyes somewhere around 1180 to 1190. And we know those dates are probably accurate because he cites as his patron Philip of Flanders. And Philip of Flanders went on crusade in 1191, where he died in Acre. So he must have commissioned this work before he went on crusade in the Levant. And it seems that Chretien died while he was writing the story. I think there's some contemporary accounts that attest to that, and that seems pretty plausible, because if we look at some of his other stories which mention other patrons that he has, we can kind of deduce that he's been writing for a long time at this point. So it's not surprising that he would have died while writing this. He probably was pretty old when he started it. And what's interesting about this story is, as I said, it's unfinished, but also it's how long the story is compared to his other stories. So all of his stories are written in verse form, like a poem, and specifically the style they're written in is called octosyllabic couplets. So it's one verse that's 8 syllables long that rhymes with another verse that's also 8 syllables long, and then it continues that pattern throughout the whole story. So Perceval is around 9,000 lines long, but all of his other stories, which are finished, are all under 7,000 lines long. And in order to finish the story, this is my amateur guess, but due to all the open plot points that he has, you'd probably need another 4,000 lines probably. And as I said, because it's unfinished, this intrigued so many people, which really liked the story, but were kind of frustrated that it was not finished. So very quickly, all these continuations popped up, and when you add them together, the continuations are several times longer than the original text. And also some of these continuations continue on other continuations as well, while other are parallel continuations that start afresh and don't mention or reference the other continuations. There's been a lot of secondary literature on this, academic papers written on this, especially in French and German in the early 20th century or late 19th century. And then in English, you start seeing a lot come into fruition around the second half of the 20th century. And now, even now, like papers still constantly get published on this text. It's very, very popular text to write about, at least within medieval studies, compared to a lot of other text, which maybe you can find 20 articles on. For this article, for this story, you can find literally thousands in multiple different languages. And I've read a lot of them, not all of them, of course, but probably, I don't know, a few hundred of these articles. And I don't know, I feel like people often miss the point with this text, or they're always trying to get something that's not there from the text. There's a lot of symbolism in this text, and I think people get too tripped up on it, or like they don't know how to navigate the symbolism that's going on, and they have all these weird theories. But I'm going to kind of try to give my theories when we come across more weird parts of the story, but by no means is my interpretation definitive. And just a quick note on the version I'm using. So I'll be reading from the Kibler translation published by Penguin Classics, but there's several different translations that you can find of this text in English, both verse and prose. This is going to be a prose translation that I'm using. So let's begin with the story. So our initial setting is what's called the Waste Forest. And although it's called like the Waste Forest or like the Wilderness Forest, it's not actually like a desert or anything. Although that word in the Old French means or can mean like a desert, it's actually pretty fertile and productive, and we're first introduced to people farming. And we're also introduced to a youth. So his name is Perceval, but we don't know his name yet, and he doesn't know his name yet, and that's also important in the story. But I'll just call him Perceval, but just know that he doesn't know his name yet. So he lives with his mom in the Waste Forest, and they have a little manor. They have some servants and some lands that they rule over. And Perceval is out kind of just playing around in the forest. It says that he has these 3 javelins, and he likes to cast them around or throw them around himself, sometimes behind himself, sometimes in front, sometimes low, and sometimes high. And then while he's doing this, he hears these 5 knights come, and they come through the forest where he's at, and he has no idea what knights are. And Perceval, as we will see, is very naive. He has learned some things from his mother, but he doesn't really know much about the world. So when these knights come, the story says, the boy heard but could not see the swiftly advancing knights. He marveled and said, by my soul, my lady mother spoke the truth when she told me that devils are more frightening than anything in the world. She instructed me to make the sign of the cross to ward them off, but I scorn her teaching, and indeed I won't cross myself. Instead, I'll strike the strongest of them at once with one of the javelins I am carrying, so that none of the others, I believe, will dare approach me. So he thinks these knights are like devils, but then when he sees these knights, he sees their shining armor and all the colors they have on their armor, he thinks that they are actually angels. And then he thinks that he sees God Almighty, and so he starts saying the creed, and he starts praying all these prayers that he knows that his mom taught him. And then one of the knights finally, pulls up to him and starts talking to him, and he says, don't be afraid, young man. And Perceval says, I'm not. By the Savior I believe in. Are you God? No, by my faith. Who are you then? I am a knight. I've never before met a knight, said the boy, nor seen one, nor ever heard tell of one. But you are more beautiful than God. Would that I were like you, so shining and so well formed. And the knights just kind of ignore his naivete for now, and they ask him if he has seen 5 knights and 3 maidens cross the clearing today. And then Perceval just ignores them, and he says, good sir, you who are called knight, what is this you carry? And the knight responds, well, I've really arrived at the ideal place, said the knight. I had intended to get information from you, my fair sweet friend, but you are seeking it from me. I'll tell you, it is my lance. And then he says, do you throw the lance like I do my javelins? And the knight's like, you are such a dolt. No, you thrust with it instead. And then he grabs one of their shields and he asks what the shield is. And then they tell him. And then there's the funny part where he asks what their chainmail armor, their hauberks are. And they're like, oh, this is armor that protects me from arrows and such. And Perceval's like, well, I thank God that God didn't, give the squirrels and the other animals this, because then I wouldn't be able to kill them. And they're just kind of like, is this dude serious? They're having a hard time. They just want answers from this boy, and he keeps asking them about their gear. But they're not too astonished, the knights, because they're like, oh, well, he's a Welshman, so that kind of makes sense. Eventually, Percival's like, hey, look, I haven't seen these people cross, but if you want to know maybe someone who has, go ask the farmers out in the fields if they've seen anybody. And then these farmers who are, I guess, serfs to some extent of him and his mother, when they see Percival with these knights, they faint, they freak out because Percival, as we'll learn, has been kept in a state of innocence about knights. And when he tells his mom what had happened and the knights that he met, it says his mother fainted at this word when she heard him say knight. And after she had recovered, she spoke like a woman in despair. Ah, woe is me, what misfortune, fair sweet son. I hoped to keep you so far from knighthood that you would never hear tell of knights, nor ever see one. You were destined for knighthood, fair son, had it pleased God to protect your father and others close to you. There was no worthier knight, no knight more feared or respected, fair son, than your father in all the isles of the sea. You can confidently boast that neither his lineage nor mine is any disgrace to you, for I too am from a knightly line, one of the best in this land. In the isles of the sea there is no finer lineage than mine in my day, but the best have fallen on hard times. And it is widely known that misfortune often comes to noblemen who cultivate great honor and prowess. Cowardice, shame, and sloth never fall on hard times. That is impossible. It is always the good who do. Your father, though you do not know it, was wounded through his thighs, and his body maimed in this way. The extensive lands and great treasures he held as a nobleman were all laid ruin, and he fell into great poverty, after the death of Uther Pendragon, who was king and father of good King Arthur. The nobles were wrongfully impoverished, disinherited, and cast into exile. Their lands were laid waste, and the poor people abused. Those who could flee, fled. Your father had this manor here in this wild forest. He could not flee, but he quickly had himself brought here in a litter, for he couldn't think of any other retreat. And you, a child at that time, had two very handsome brothers. You were tiny, still being nursed, barely over 2 years old. And then he learns about how his two younger brothers eventually served other kings, but then died. One of the themes I want to touch on that we just heard here is this idea of a decline after the death of Arthur's father, Uther Pendragon. We're going to see an almost like post-apocalyptic landscape where there's a lot of decline, a lot of war, a lot of things that aren't set right. And we'll see some examples later on, but just keep that in mind that this isn't like a prosperous Britain. Rather, this is a very a Britain in decline, you could say. And Arthur is trying his best to keep it together, but he's having a hard time. And Percival's father was, quote unquote, wounded in the thighs, which means that he was castrated or something like that. He's unable to, he kind of loses his fertility. And his two older brothers died as knights. So his mother has kind of kept him in this state of naivete. But after she drops this monologue on him about, who he is, or not who he is, but what his background is, who his father and brothers were, Perceval says, "Give me something to eat. I don't understand your words, but I would gladly go to the king who makes knights, and I will go no matter what." So his mother kind of realizes, okay, he's going to be a knight. I've tried to protect him from this course, but he's just going to do it anyways. And before he sets off, his mom gives him these buckskin garments, and it's like one piece. And if you look into some of the miniatures that are in some of the manuscripts, so these are little scenes from the story found in some of the medieval manuscripts, you'll see these depictions of Perceval, and it looks like he's wearing this giant onesie that covers his feet all the way to his head, and that's kind of brown and fuzzy. It looks like a baby almost, which is probably intentional. And then the other thing that happens is his mom gives him some advice. She says, "Fair son, I want to give you some advice that you would do very well to heed, and if it pleases you to remember it, great profit can come to you. Before long, you'll be a knight, son, so I believe, if it is God's will. Should you encounter near or far a lady in need of aid, or a maiden in distress, make yourself ready to assist them if they ask for your help, for it is the most honorable thing to do. He who fails to honor ladies finds his own honor dead inside him. Serve ladies and maidens, and you will be honored everywhere. And if you ask any for her love, be careful not to annoy her by doing anything to displease her. He who kisses a maiden gains much, but if she grants you a kiss, I forbid you to go any farther, if you'll refrain from my sake. But if she has a ring on her finger or an alms purse at her belt, and if she gives it to you for love or at your request, I'll not object to you wearing her ring. I'll give you leave to take the ring and the alms purse. Fair son, I have something more to tell you. Never keep company with anyone for very long, whether at an inn or on the road, without asking his name. Learn his name in full, for by the name one knows the man. Fair son, speak to gentlemen, keep company with gentlemen. Gentlemen never lead astray those who keep their company. Above all, I want to beg you to pray to our Lord in chapel and church, to give you honor in this world, and grant that your deeds may ensure that you come to a good end. And then he asks his mom, what's a chapel? And she says, it's a place where one worships him who made heaven and earth and placed man and beast upon it. And then he asks what a church is. And then she goes, explains, she says, this son, a most holy and beautiful building with relics and treasures where they sacrificed the body of Jesus Christ, the holy prophet whom the Jews greatly defiled. He was betrayed and wrongfully condemned and suffered the pains of death for men and women alike, whose souls went to hell when they left their bodies, and he redeemed them. He was bound to the stake, beaten, and then crucified, and wore a crown of thorns. I urge you to go to churches and hear masses and matins, and to worship this Lord. After all of this, Perceval goes off to become a knight. And as he's crossing the bridge, away from the waste forest, over to where King Arthur's court is being held, he sees his mother faint, but then he keeps riding on. And after he rides off, he has his first adventure when he mistakes a tent, like a nice silken tent that a noble would use for travel. He mistakes the tent for a church. So, following the advice of his mother, thinking it's a church, he goes inside, but then he sees a woman sleeping on the bed in there. And then he forcefully kisses her. And then he takes the ring off her for her finger, and then he eats the food in the tent and then leaves. And the whole time, the lady in the tent is resisting. She's saying, no, stop it, don't do this. And all the while, Perceval is justifying this in his head by saying, hey, look, I'm just doing what my mother told me. I'm following her advice about how to handle or how to interact with women. And the lady the whole time is concerned mostly with how her lover, who's out and about in the forest, like hunting or something, how he is going to react when he comes in, because he's going to see that the food is being eaten, he's going to see that her ring is gone, and he's not going to be happy. So when he does come back, she tries to explain what happened, how this wild youth tried to kiss her, or did kiss her, and then took her ring and then ate the food, but did nothing more. The lover doesn't believe her. He thinks that some sort of affair occurred. No, you liked it and were pleased by it, he says. You never tried to stop him, said the man, tormented by jealousy. Do you think I don't know you? Indeed, I know you only too well. My eyes are not so blind or squinting that I cannot see your falseness. You've embarked on a wicked path, and you're proceeding up a painful road, for your horse will never again eat oats nor be cared for until I am avenged. And should it lose a shoe, it will not be reshod. If it dies, you will follow me on foot. You shall not change the clothes you're wearing, but will follow me naked and on foot until I've cut off his head. Nothing less will satisfy me. So because of Perceval's actions, this girl is being punished by her quote-unquote lover. But Perceval leaves the scene, as if nothing had happened. Nothing, in his mind, he didn't do anything wrong. And he eventually makes his way to Arthur's court. And outside of Arthur's court, or outside of it where he's staying, he notices that there's a red knight with a golden cup in his hand. And he says, hey, I really want that armor. So he goes inside of Arthur's court. And mind you, he's still on his horse, Arthur's in some sort of I think it's a castle or some sort of building, and Perceval enters on his horse, which is a major faux pas. There's squires saying, hey, we could take your horse, but he's like, no, I'm good. And so he walks up to Arthur, or I guess more rides up to Arthur, and his horse's head actually gets so close to Arthur that it knocks King Arthur's hat off. And Arthur finally says something, and he says, Dear brother, welcome. I beg you not to take it ill that I failed to answer your greeting. My anger prevented a reply, for the greatest enemy I have, who hates and distresses me most, has just laid claim to my land, and is so impertinent as to state that he'll have it whether I like it or not. He's called the Red Knight from the forest of Quinqueroy, and the queen had come here to sit in my presence to see and to comfort these wounded knights. The knight would never have angered me by words alone, but he snatched away my cup and lifted it so insolently that he spilled all the wine in it over the queen. After this dreadful deed, the queen returned to her chambers in deadly fury and grief. So help me God, I don't think she'll come out alive. And then Perceval, being the naive boy that he, is right now, he basically just ignores everything that the king says, and he says, "Make me a knight, Sir King, for I wish to be on my way." And then he says that he wants the red armor from the Red Knight that's outside of the court. And then Kay, Lord Kay, the seneschal, the guy who manages the kind of like the affairs, like the inner household affairs of the king and the court. We've met him a few times in some other stories, other Arthurian stories, and he's kind of like a stock character that is always, or almost always, very kind of rash and spiteful, and has this real mean streak about him. He's a good knight and all that, and he's very loyal. Like, no one questions his loyalty. However, he is rash. So Kay's kind of having a good time making fun of the boy, and he says, yeah, basically go out and get it, see what happens. And then Arthur rebukes Kay for his manners. And then Kay kind of has this fit when Perceval greets a maiden, and the maiden laughs, and then Kay slaps her because of the jester's prophecy, or the jester kind of has this prophetic moment when he says, "This maiden will not laugh until she has seen the man who will be the supreme lord among all knights." So that's why Kay slaps her, because Kay realizes that since she laughed, that Perceval, if you take the jester seriously, is supposed to be the greatest of all the knights. So going back to Perceval, he's like, well, I want the armor, and I've been told I can go and get it. So he rides out, and then he actually does kill the Red Knight. So the Red Knight sees him, talks to him, and realizes that he wants his armor. And so the Red Knight charges at him, hits him in the shoulder, but then Perceval throws his javelin and hits his eye and his brain, and he kills the Red Knight. And Perceval's now like, yeah, I gotta have his armor. However, he realizes that he has no idea how to take off a knight's armor, and he's like, well, I guess I'm just going to chop up his body. But then there's a squire from the court who's like, no, look, I'll help you take it off and put it on yourself. So the squire takes off the Red Knight's armor, gives the red armor to Perceval. But what's notable about this interaction is that Perceval doesn't want to take off his like buckskin Welsh garb that he has on. The squire's like, hey, look, we can get you a nice silk one. But he's like, no, I don't want that. Just put the armor over what I'm wearing. And this, I think, is supposed to symbolize like how even though Perceval might outwardly be a knight now, he has like the armor and the weapons. Underneath all of that, he is still a naive Welsh boy. So Perceval heads off. He doesn't go back to the court to see King Arthur. He goes off and he says that he's never going to return until he avenges the slap that Kay gave to the lady. And then the squire that was with Perceval, he goes back to the court and tells the court what happened. And they're all quite bewildered that such a naive boy actually, was able to kill this knight who was harassing King Arthur's court. Now, as he's traveling again, he meets a gentleman who has a castle, and he goes up to him and says, "Sir, my mother taught me to go up to gentlemen, to take advice from them, and to believe what they tell me, for profit comes to them who believe them." The gentleman replied, "Dear brother, blessed be your mother, for she advised you well, but don't you wish to ask something else?" "Yes, and what is that?" "This and no more, that you give me lodging this day." "Most willingly," said the gentleman, "if you'll grant me a boon that I will bring you great profit, as you'll see." "And what is that?" he asked. "That you believe your mother's advice and mine." "In faith," Perceval said, "I grant it." So this nobleman can tell that Perceval really isn't a knight. Like it talks about earlier, how Perceval doesn't really know how to hold his lance and ride his horse all that well. So when he sees him, he's like, look, he might have the armor, but he needs to, learn a thing or two. So this guy takes him under his wing a little bit and teaches him the basics of knighthood, how to fight. Like he says, look, if you break your lands, you use your sword. It teaches him how to ride and, some of the other basics of chivalry that were expected of any knight. And he wants Perceval to stay with him. But Perceval says that he wants to get back to his mother, who he saw faint, and he wants to know whether or not she's alive or not. And so after a day of teaching Perceval, he's finally able to get him to take off his buckskin onesie thing that his mother gave him, and he's able to put on a silk one that he gives him. And then this gentleman, his name is Gornemont, he knights Perceval and he gives him some advice. Young man, remember that if you are ever compelled to go into combat with any knight, I want to beg one thing of you. If you gain the upper hand and he is no longer able to defend himself or hold out against you, you must grant him mercy rather than killing him outright. And be careful not to be too talkative or prone to gossip. Anyone who is too talkative soon discovers he had said something that brings him reproach. And the wise man says and declares, he who talks much commits a sin. Therefore, young man, I warn you not to talk too much, and I beseech you, if you find a maiden or a woman, be she damsel or lady, who is disconsolate in any way, to do right by consoling her if you know how to console her and are able to do so. And do not scorn another lesson I would teach you, for it must not be scorned. Go gladly to church and pray to him who made all things to have mercy on your soul and keep you a true Christian in this earthly life. And then he tells Perceval, you must never again claim, dear brother, that your mother taught or instructed you. I don't blame you at all for having said it until now, but henceforth, begging your pardon, I urge you to correct yourself, for if you continue to say that, people will take you for a fool. Therefore, I urge you to refrain from saying that. Then what shall I say, good sir? You can say that the vavasor who attached your spur taught and instructed you. So we see this idea of Perceval kind of ascending the hierarchy, you could say. He starts out by the lessons that his mother taught him. And then this gentleman, Gornemont, teaches him some things about chivalry and kind of about manhood. He kind of like you can view him as a sort of like substitute father, because Perceval grew up without a father or even without any brothers. He was just raised by his mother. So this guy teaches him how to fight, how to ride his horse, how to be a good knight. And he says many things that his mother also says. He says like, go to church, be nice to the ladies, things like that. But he also gives him some more advice to add on to that. He's like, now that you know how to do that, or now that you're like a knight and you have this armor, more is going to be expected of you now. And I also want you to remember for later how Gornemont tells Perceval that you should not be too talkative. And the other thing that he tells Perceval in the beginning when he first meets him is that you should believe your mother's advice and my advice. So Perceval needs to know how to combine both what the Gornemont says and what his mother says and not view them as antagonistic. And then he goes off, now that he's a knight, in search of his mother. And he goes back into the waste forest, and he's pretty deep into it. And he finds this rickety old castle, and he asks for lodging. And then the guard grants him access, and when he gets into the town is totally desolate. The people in the town look like they're starving, and even the churches are in ill repair. But nonetheless, he's allowed to stay, and he's greeted in the castle by the most beautiful maiden. The poem goes on at length to describe her. God had made her an unsurpassed marvel to dazzle men's hearts and minds. Never since has he made her equal, nor had he ever before. However, when they start eating, and she gives him hospitality, he doesn't say anything. He remains silent. And this is to follow the advice of Gornemont, who told him to, remain silent and not to talk, too much, or else you'll be considered like a fool. And then people even begin to wonder, because he's been so silent for so long, if this knight is mute. And so then the maiden realizes that he isn't going to speak unless she speaks to him first. So she begins talking to him, and they have a little bit of back and forth. And then they learn that Perceval just came from Gornemont's castle, and that Gornemont is actually the uncle of this maiden. So already they have some pretty good rapport going for them. And she tells Perceval how the castle and the town has been under siege for quite a while, and that's why there's very little food, and why people are starving and everything's in disarray, and how their force of knights has been dwindled down to very little. And then that evening, when they go to bed, there's this very debated and very talked about scene between the two of these people. So between the maiden and between Perceval, whether or not they actually, did the deed, so to speak. So I'll read it, and then I'll give my opinion on this. That night, the knight, being Perceval, had all the comfort and delight one could hope for in a bed, except for the pleasure of a maiden's company, if he pleased, or a lady's had it been permitted. But he knew nothing of these pleasures and never thought of them at all, so he promptly fell asleep, having not a care in the world. But his hostess, so this is the beautiful woman that we met, shut in her chamber, did not rest. While he slept peacefully, she pondered, for she could offer no defense against an imminent attack, the people who are attacking her castle. She tossed and turned constantly, restless and upset. Finally, she put on a short mantle of red silk over her shift, and bravely and courageously started on her mission, which was not an idle one, for she was determined to go to her guest and tell him a part of her troubles. She arose from her bed and left her chamber. She was so frightened that all her limbs were trembling, and her body was bathed in perspiration. Weeping, she left her room and came, still weeping and sighing, to the bed where the knight was asleep. So she goes to Perceval's bedroom. She knelt down and leaned over him, weeping now so copiously that her tears dampened his entire face. She dared do nothing more. She wept so much that he awakened, astounded and amazed at finding his face all damp, and beheld her kneeling beside his bed, embracing him tightly around the neck. But he was courteous enough to take her in his arms at once and draw her to him. He said to her, "Sweet lady, what's the matter? What has brought you here?" "Ah, gentle knight, have pity on me in the name of God and his Son. I beg you not to despise me for having come in here, or for being nearly naked. I mean no folly, no wickedness or evil, for there is nothing living in this world so wonderful or distraught that I am not more sorrowful still. Nothing I have is pleasing to me, for I am constantly plagued by troubles. I am so miserable that I'll not live to see another night beyond this one, nor another day beyond tomorrow. I'll kill myself instead. Of 310 knights who garrison this castle, there are but 50 left." And then she goes on and on about how the castle's under siege, how they don't have supplies, and they're running out of food, and all of that. And then eventually Perceval says, "Lay down in this bed beside me. It's wide enough for us both. You won't leave me again today." She said, "If it pleases you, I shall stay." And he kissed her and held her tightly in his arms. He placed her gently and comfortably beneath the coverlet, and she let him kiss her. I do not believe it displeased her. Thus they lay side by side with lips touching all night long, until morning came and day dawned. He brought her so much comfort that night that they slept with lips pressed to lips and arm in arm until day broke. At dawn the maiden returned to her own chamber. So some people think that they were, doing the deed, so to speak, while they were in bed together. However, I disagree for a couple of reasons. First off, I think that Perceval is so innocent, or he's still pretty innocent at this stage, that he doesn't even know what it would even mean to lie with a lady. Second off, there is a couple other very obvious sexual moments in this work, or very implied sexual moments, and the language that Chretien uses is a bit more explicit. And here we don't see that explicitness. We see a very naive boy kind of comforting this woman. It definitely might have sexual undertones or even overtones, you could say, but I don't think it was explicitly them doing something in the bed. But I thought I would mention it because people have talked about it a lot for various reasons, and I just want to say that I don't think they did, and I don't think the text really supports the fact that they did either. Also, Chretien doesn't really like to show, in his other works, he doesn't really like to show non-marital affairs. Or when he does show them, he wants to let you know that he thinks that it's a bad thing. Even his famous Lancelot story involving Lancelot having an affair with the queen wasn't even finished by Chretien. The most raunchiest parts, so to speak, were written by another person who completed the story. And it's pretty obvious that Chretien does not like that sort of thing, that he was kind of forced to by his patroness. And the other thing that makes me think that it's not the case as well is that her name, we learn, is Blanchefleur, which means white flower. And this is kind of a stock name you see in some medieval stories, which means a pure woman. So given that her name is that, and Chretien doesn't really deal with irony with regards to names, for the most part at least, not that I can think of. Normally if he names someone, or if they have a sort of name that means something, that says something about that person, or he doesn't really subvert your expectations. Okay, enough of that. So The next day, Perceval goes out to fight Aguingueron, one of the guys who is besieging the castle, and he defeats him. And if you read the text closely, you could tell that he defeats him using the advice that he learned from Gornemon, the worthy man, like how he switches to a sword once his lance breaks. He then sends him off as a prisoner to King Arthur's court. So Perceval himself is not taking him, but just by the code of chivalry, he knows that he is obliged to go to King Arthur. So he goes to King Arthur, having been beaten. And then Perceval has a fight with Clamadu, who is Aguingueron, the guy he just beat. That's his lord. And they attack the castle with 20 knights. But then Perceval goes out to fight them, and he captures some of them and kills the others. And then once he captures and defeats Clamadu, he sends him as well to King Arthur as a prisoner. And with this, the siege is lifted, and there's a great fanfare because now, food can get in, the people are happy, and it's all thanks to Perceval. And because of this, Blanchefleur tells Perceval that she is now his lady. While everyone is celebrating, Perceval has other things on his mind. The story reads, "But he was intent on other things. He remembered his mother, whom he had seen fall in a faint, and he wanted to go to see her more than anything else. But he dared not take leave of his lady, for she refused and denied him, and commanded all her people to beg him to stay. But all their pleadings were in vain, except that he did promise them that if he found his mother alive, he would bring her back with him, and from that day forward she would rule the land. Of this they could be sure, and if she were dead, he would likewise return." And so he set off, promising to return, leaving his noble sweetheart very sorrowful and distressed, just like all the others. So he travels for a day, and he's praying that he'll find his mother alive. And then he runs into a river, and he's sure that his mother is on the other side of this river, but there's no way across. There's no bridge, and there's no way around. It's a pretty wide river. And in that river, he encounters two men who are fishing, and they tell him that he can't cross. They tell him there's no, it's going to be a while till you find a place you can cross. But they do offer him lodging on the side of the river that he's on, and they say that they have a castle that he can go into. They kind of give him directions where to find the castle. So Perceval goes into that castle. He finds it with a little bit of difficulty, but he finally finds it. And when he gets into the castle, he finds the lord that he had met earlier on the boat. When the lord saw him approaching, he greeted him at once, saying, "Friend, don't be offended if I don't rise to greet you, for it is not easy for me to do so." "In God's name, sire," Perceval replied, "say no more, for I am not at all offended, as God gives me health and happiness." To do his guest honor, the gentleman rose as much as he was able, and said, "Friend, come over here and don't be frightened of me. Sit down confidently at my side, for so I command you." The youth sat down beside him, and the nobleman continued, "Friend, where did you come from today?" And then Perceval tells him how he come from the place where Blanchefleur was under siege. And then after that, the nobleman says, "So help me God," said the nobleman, "you've ridden a great distance today. You must have set off traveling this morning before the watchman sounded the dawn." "No," said the youth, "I assure you that the hour of prime had already been sounded." So what he's saying is that the hour of prime is a liturgical hour that correlates with one of the services of the church. And it roughly correlates to something around like 6 a.m. So he's telling him that he didn't leave before dawn, that he left after dawn. And again, we see this theme here about how distance and space have this weird relationship, at least in this first part of the story. Like travel, or the way that space works, is not as it would ordinarily work. There's something kind of magical going on. That's the implication. And one area that we see this is the fact that the nobleman was already at the castle, and as we just read, he has a very hard time getting up, much less, moving about to be able to climb these hills to get over to the castle where he's at. The lord of the castle then gives Perceval a great gift in the form of a sword. It says it has gold work on it, and it's a magnificently created sword, very powerful. Even the straps are very precious. And the story says, "I assure you it was magnificent at his side, and even better in his grip, and it was obvious that in time of need he would wield it bravely." However, it also says that it could not be broken except in one singular circumstance known only to him who had forged it and tempered it. Unfortunately, we're not going to really see any action with this sword or it really be brought up again except for a few passing references. It's probably something Chretien wanted to come back to in the story, but because this is incomplete, he never gets back to it. Okay, so now we're going to come to what is perhaps the most famous passage in all of Chretien's writings. So, as they were speaking, so Perceval and the nobleman, as they were speaking of one thing and another, a squire came forth from a chamber carrying a white lance by the middle of its shaft. He passed between the fire and those seated upon the bed. Everyone in the hall saw the white lance with its white point, from whose tip there issued a drop of blood, and this red drop flowed down to the squire's hand. The youth who had come there that night observed this marvel, but refrained from asking how it came about, for he recalled the admonition given by the gentleman who had knighted him, who taught and instructed him not to talk too much. He was afraid that if he asked, they would consider him uncouth, and therefore he did not ask. Then 2 other squires entered, holding in their hands candelabra of pure gold, crafted with enamel inlays. The young men carrying the candelabra were extremely handsome. In each of the candelabra there were at least 10 candles burning. A maiden, accompanying the 2 young men, was carrying a Grail with her 2 hands. She was beautiful, noble, and richly attired. After she had entered the hall carrying the Grail, the room was so brightly illumined that the candles lost their brilliance like stars and the moon when the sun rises. After her came another maiden, carrying a silver carving platter. The Grail, which was introduced first, was of fine pure gold. Set in the Grail were precious stones of many kinds, the best and costliest to be found in earth or sea. The Grail stones were finer than any other in the world, without any doubt. The Grail passed by like the lance. They passed in front of the bed and into another chamber. The young knight watched them pass by, but did not dare ask who was served from the Grail, for in his heart he always held the wise gentleman's advice. Yet I fear that this may be to his misfortune, for I have heard it said that at times it is just as wrong to keep too silent as to talk too much. Whether for good or for ill, he did not ask or inquire anything of them. And then they begin to eat, and it goes quite in depth about the food that they're eating and like the tablecloths and like the table itself, because it's all very ornate and richly decorated, and the food, it says, was fit for a king or even an emperor. And then as they're eating, the Grail keeps going back and forth in front of them, from one room to another room. However, Perceval, again, he keeps silent the whole time that the Grail is passing through. So this right here is the first literary instance we have of what we know as the Grail. This scene right here and some subsequent scenes sets up in the Western imagination, or even around the world, not just Western, right, about what the Grail is. So the word itself, Grail, there's a little bit of debate about what that word means. However, it's probably like a Latin word, or it's like a Catalonian word from like the southeast of France that means a shallow bowl, like a shallow serving dish. Specifically, they were designed to be used for eating fish in, and that's going to become important a little bit later in the story, so keep that in mind. And then there's also the spear that we see as well. However, in later adaptations of the Grail motif, you don't really see the spear come into play. I won't go into the entire argument that I have about what's going on here, but I will put forth and I will link to an essay that I wrote a while ago going into the nitty-gritty of the argument. But I think what's going on here is that Chretien, through some way, somehow, and I list out a couple of different ways he could have known this, is influenced by the Divine Liturgy, specifically the Great Entrance, where you see something similar happen during the service. I'll talk more about some of the significances of the Grail and the lance later on when we encounter further scenes. But for now, the main thing I want you to know about this scene is that Perceval doesn't ask what's going on. He doesn't ask who's being served. And his reasoning is that he doesn't want to talk too much. However, if you read like a couple lines above, before the procession started, it says that he was talking quite a lot, actually. So all of a sudden, he doesn't want to talk, even though just a few moments beforehand, he was, just blabbering his mouth. And then the poem also says that after the meal, the two stayed a long while in conversation. So it doesn't seem like talking is really the issue here. Anyways, Perceval says to himself that he is just going to ask the squires in the morning what was going on with the Grail. And so he goes to sleep, but when he wakes up, it is totally empty. There is nobody in the castle. There is nobody anywhere. He searches and he yells, and as he's leaving the castle, like he's exiting from the drawbridge, the bridge starts coming up. Actually, it starts coming up before he's even fully left the bridge, and his horse has to make a little jump. And then he yells, he's like, "Who's there? Who's there?" And nobody answers. He does, however, find some hoof tracks, and then he kind of follows those tracks until he finds a grieving lady holding her headless knight or / lover. And she says to him, "Good sir," said the maiden, "a knight killed him just this morning, but your appearing here is truly remarkable. As God is my witness, they say that one could ride for 25 leagues in the direction from which you have come without finding a good, honest, and proper lodging place. Yet your horse's belly is so full and his coat so shining that he couldn't appear more satisfied or his coat smoother had he been washed and combed and given a bed of hay and oats. And it appears to me that you yourself have had a comfortable and restful night." So again, we see travel, space, time isn't what it seems in this part of the world. Then Perceval responds, "Upon my word, I was as comfortable as I could possibly be, and it's only right that it should show. If you were to shout out loudly from this spot, you could easily be heard at the place where I slept last night. You must not know this country well or have traveled through all of it, for without a doubt I had the best lodgings I ever enjoyed." And then she kind of realizes, she says, "Ah, my lord, did you sleep then in the castle of the noble Fisher King?" And then they realize they're talking about the same thing, and the lady asks him, she says, "Tell me whether you saw the lance with the tip that bleeds, though it has neither blood nor veins." "Yes, upon my word, I did see it." "And did you ask why it bled?" "I never spoke a word. So help me God, let me tell you then that you have done ill. And did you see the Grail?" "Quite clearly." "Who carried it?" "A maiden." "Where did she come from?" "From a chamber." "And where did she go?" "She entered another chamber." "Did anyone perceive the Grail?" "Yes." "Who?" "Only 2 squires." "And what were they holding in their hands?" "Candelabra full of candles." "And who came after the Grail?" "Another maiden." "What was she holding?" "A small silver carving platter." "Did you ask the people where they were going in this manner?" "No question came from my mouth." "So help me God," she says, "now it's even worse. What is your name, friend?" And the youth, who did not know his name, guessed, and said he was called Perceval the Welshman. But although he did not know if that were true or not, he spoke the truth without knowing it. And when the damsel heard him, she stood up before him and said as in anger, "Your name is changed, fair friend." "To what?" "Perceval the Wretched." And we quickly find out that this is actually Perceval's first cousin. And then she kind of goes on this kind of monologue. She says, "Unlucky Perceval, how unfortunate were you when you failed to ask all this, because you would have brought great succor to the good king who is maimed. He would have totally regained the use of his limbs and ruled his lands, and much good would have come of it. But understand this now, much suffering will befall you and others, and understand too that it came upon you because you sinned against your mother, who has died of grief on your account. I know you better than you do me, for you do not know who I am. I was raised with you for many years in your mother's house. I am your first cousin and you are mine. Your failure to have asked what is done with the Grail and where it is carried is just as painful to me as your mother's death or the death of this knight whom I have loved and held dear, who called me his dearest friend and loved me like a good and faithful knight." So then Perceval realizes that his mother is dead, and the lady reveals that she actually saw his mother being buried. And it is for this reason, Perceval causing the death of his mother, that he failed to ask the right questions during the Grail procession. And then she also notices his sword, and she says to be careful, don't trust it, since it will surely fail you when you enter the fray, for it will shatter to pieces. With this, Perceval leaves her, and he goes off in search of the knight who killed his cousin's lover. Okay, I think this is a good stopping point. This might have to be a three-parter, but I'm totally okay with that. I got through a lot less than I thought I would with, under 50 minutes. So anyways, this is the first part, maybe of 2 or possibly 3. So I hope you enjoyed this, and we'll continue this story later and learn more about the Grail and the lance. Thank you so much.